Story 1. I work in a used record store, a place where the smell of old vinyl and dust is almost the smell of history. Every week, people of different ages and interests come here. Some of them are looking for rare albums, others old records that have long lost their relevance, but still retain their value in the eyes of collectors. Chris, my colleague, and I often spend days here turning over stacks of scratched CDs and tapes, trying to figure out what's worth keeping on the shelves and what's best to throw out. It seems like in all the time I've been working here, I've seen it all. Weird pirate mixtapes that someone had once recorded on an old tape recorder. Retro albums from the 80s with tattered covers and collections of completely unremarkable indie bands. All this was ordinary, boring merchandise, dusty old stuff that no one listens to anymore, except for a couple of vintage-loving fans. However, one day, among a pile of such ordinary, unremarkable CDs, I noticed something that should have passed me by, as always. It was just a black case, ordinary, not giving anything away. I was about to throw it away without giving it any importance, but something stopped me. No cover, no logo, no markings. Just written on the box, in faint, shaky handwriting, was the words, "Listen alone." Something about those words made me think. I picked up the disc and looked at it. The handwriting was strange, careless, as if someone was trying to convey something with special effort. Uneven lines and at the same time a clear sense of some kind of nervousness, desperation. It was so different from all the others. I felt something inside me pushing me to see what was inside. I held the disc up to the light and noticed that the very material it was made of looked different somehow. The surface was not just smooth like a regular CD, but covered in strange marks, as if someone had handled it with dirty hands, leaving invisible fingerprints that later became part of the plastic itself. I looked at the disc doubtfully. Maybe it was someone's old demo tape that wasn't worth anything? Maybe this was someone's forgotten mix. Was I really going to waste my time on this useless crap? But really, something about this disc was making me wary. I couldn't just pass it by. After much thought, I put aside all my business and, as if by inspiration, looked into the old box where I kept old players and headphones. After some time, I inserted the disc into my old CD player. For some reason, I felt uneasy, like I was breaking some invisible rule. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this disc. The melody that began to sound through the headphones was soft, foggy, unclear. Everything around was swallowed by this strange music, slow and somewhat sharp. The notes seemed to be out of place, as if the piano had been tuned incorrectly. It was like something abandoned, forgotten, like music that might remind one of an old box containing a mechanical toy. At first I thought it was just static and tried to adjust the volume, but the music didn't go away. It just got louder, more ominous and mysterious. And then I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost invisible against the background of the music. At first I thought it was just an illusion. I leaned in, hoping to make out something, and at that moment it seemed to me that the words had changed. They seemed to be alive, living separately from the music. The whisper, it changed its tone, as if it were reacting to my movements. When I shifted, when I simply coughed, its frequency changed. I felt a chill run down my spine. For a moment I thought it was all just my imagination, but when I reached for my headphones to turn off the music, I heard it again. The whisper was in the room. It wasn't coming from the headphones, it was in the air, and it was ominous. I froze as my fingers slid over the switch. The room grew even quieter. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, the air too thick, as if something was trying to squeeze the space around me. I turned on the light, and as soon as the lamp flared up, I felt the tension disappear, but not from inside me. Something continued to pull me along. I turned off the player. Silence. I relaxed, stood up, and stretched. But the feeling that something was wrong in the room did not leave me. I couldn't figure out what it all meant. Maybe it was just my fatigue, my worries after a hard day at work. I decided that it was all just a coincidence. But still, I felt that somewhere there, in this strange CD, something was hidden. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue, just a coincidence. But with every sound, with every step, when I passed some unfamiliar object or old box, It seemed to me that something was looking at me. I couldn't forget that voice, that whisper. Listen alone. Something about that warning made me realize it wasn't just a strange coincidence, and I still didn't know what was behind it. The morning began like all the previous ones. The smell of freshly baked bread hung in the air, and the sounds of the city, as always, mixed into a monotonous hum. But unlike other days, I felt like something was bothering me. I couldn't get that strange disc out of my head, its whispers and the strange feeling that someone was following me. I woke up with this feeling, and it didn't leave me all night. It grew stronger with each passing minute, as if invisible eyes were looking out from the dark corners of my apartment. I am used to strange events because my job at the store has always brought many unexplained moments. People often come here to tell stories about how the items they buy suddenly start behaving strangely. Records that are handed over to consignment shops are rumored to sometimes be difficult. But I never took these rumors seriously until I found myself in the middle of this story. I looked at the disc again. It was still lying on the shelf as if it wanted to remind me of itself. I stood up, getting ready to go to the store, but returned to that case again. Maybe I was a little superstitious, but I felt like there was something hidden in it, something more than just music. And then, as if on a whim, I put it back in the player. The music started playing, just as strange as the first time. But this time, I knew something was wrong. Each chord felt in my chest, as if it was entering me directly, squeezing, capturing. The whisper was faint, but I heard it clearly, even through the music. It was close. It was here. The voices were coming from the headphones, incredibly quietly. But something inside me whispered that they weren't coming from the speakers. My fingers trembled as I tried to turn off the player, but it wouldn't turn off. It was as if the music itself continued playing, ignoring all attempts to stop it. I felt the air in the room become thick, as if I was inside some other world where the laws of physics and reality were violated. My body did not obey. I could not move. All I could do was listen. The whispers grew louder, and although I tried to stand up and remove the headphones, I was paralyzed by the sound. It did not stop. With every word, I felt something inside me crumble, as if something old and forgotten was waking up and trying to break out. I wanted to stop this nightmare, but I couldn't. And suddenly, in one of those whispers, I made out a word that I could not forget. Past. I jerked upright, but found myself sitting up again, as if my movements were helpless. My head was filled with a terrible understanding, as if I had suddenly remembered something I had long forgotten. Memory. Strange memories began to surface in my head, but they were vague. It was as if I saw someone whose face I could not remember, whose words were spoken, but I could not make out what they meant. And the more I tried to remember, the stronger that strange, all-encompassing whisper became. I felt scenes I had no memory of begin to emerge in my head, familiar, but so distant that they seemed part of someone else's life. I jumped up and ripped out my headphones. Silence. It was deafening. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the walls. I tried to analyze what was happening. Maybe it was just a glitch in the player, or is the old drive starting to fail? Maybe I got too carried away with all this, and my nerves gave way under the pressure of hard work and empty days. But something about this strange incident haunted me. The moment when I realized that in this disc, in these whispers, there was something much greater than I could have imagined. I looked at the box again, at the fuzzy words written on it. Listen alone. The warning repeated in my head like a mantra. I looked back at the player, and at that moment it became clear to me that I couldn't just forget about it. I needed to figure out this mysterious disc. What forces were behind it? Why was I drawn to him, despite all the signs that I was interfering with something far more dangerous than I could have imagined? I picked up the disc and it felt even heavier than before, as if I was holding not just a record, but a piece of something ancient and lost. My gaze fell on the back of the box, where one word was written, remember. But how can you remember something that never happened? I couldn't leave that disc. Every day it became a part of me, and although I tried to talk myself into forgetting it, it seemed to be embedded in my life, penetrating my thoughts and nightmares. At first I thought it was just an exaggeration, some inexplicable anxiety that would go away as soon as I stopped paying attention to it. But it didn't go away. It grew stronger. The nights I put the disc on and listened to it again became more and more intense. The whispers became more and more distinct, the phrases more and more meaningful. I felt like someone was watching me. The voices that were initially weak and unclear now became lifelike. Sometimes it seemed like someone was standing nearby, in the dark part of the room, watching my every move. But when I turned around, there was no one there. So I decided that maybe it was worth sorting this out once and for all. I started looking for any information about the disc, its history, people who might know something like that. There was not a word about this strange artifact on the internet, but something told me that I was not alone. The strange feeling that I was on the brink of something important and dangerous did not leave me. As time went on, I began to feel more and more drawn to the old mirror that stood in the hallway. It was dark, with a frame that had been clouded by time, but for some reason it became the center of my attention. I didn't know what it was about this mirror that attracted me. When I approached it, I often noticed how its surface became slightly matte, as if something was trying to seep through it. One night, when I woke up again from strange sensations, I decided to look in the mirror to somehow justify my internal worries. But I did not expect what I saw. The mirror did not reflect me as usual. Instead of my reflection, something else froze on the surface. I could not make out what it was. It moved, but it was not clear. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some kind of glare, and I wanted to move away. But then I noticed, in the reflection, as if from the very depths of the mirror, a face appeared. It was blurry, almost inhuman, with fuzzy but distinct eyes. The eyes were looking straight at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I recoiled, unable to tear my eyes away from this strange image. Everything inside me screamed that I had to leave, that this was not normal, that I was on the brink of something terrible. But the voice in my head would not listen. It whispered, "Keep looking." I took another step towards the mirror, and suddenly it became cloudy, as if something had leaked into the world. The lines and shapes that had been clear before began to fade into obscurity. Some other figures appeared in the reflection, blurred silhouettes like shadows sliding around the corners. I saw their movements becoming faster and faster, and their faces were familiar, but I couldn't remember where I knew them from. With each glance, I felt something begin to happen inside me. Something dark, ancient, was beginning to awaken. The whispers in my mind grew louder, almost like a scream, and I instinctively stepped back. But the mirror continued to pull me, its surface warping as if it were becoming a part of me, absorbing my reflection, my soul. I felt its coldness begin to penetrate me, and I could no longer look. I ran out of the hallway in a panic, my heart pounding in my chest. It seemed like everything that was happening with that disc and that mirror was part of some big game, something I couldn't quite understand. But I knew one thing: it wouldn't stop. It would continue until I figured out what was behind it. I grabbed the disc, put it back in the player, and the music, strange, mesmerizing, filled the room. But now I knew it wasn't just music. It was more. I tried to get rid of this disc. I went into the night city, leaving it in the corner of the room, but as soon as silence came, it returned. Every time I turned off the light and tried to fall asleep, the feeling of something following me would not go away. It was as if the voice from that disc never left me for a moment, and despite all my determination, I could not just leave it. Something about this sound was so compelling that I began to feel like I was part of its world. Sounds that had once been distant were now becoming closer, more real. It was as if each note was a step towards me, and I, without understanding why, kept going there. Leaving him would mean leaving this heavy attraction, but also my doubts, and I was not ready. And then one day, at that very moment when I put the disc back into the player, not knowing that it would be the last, I felt something new. The sounds began to change their structure. They were not simply chaotic as before. They became clear, threatening. I knew that they were addressed to me. Every word, every chord now sounded like a beckoning call. But it soon became clear that I was no longer just listening to music. I had become part of this world, a world in which there was no space, no time, no order, only darkness and sounds that moved inside me. I couldn't tell if I was physically there or if it was just a memory that made me doubt that I existed at all. Everything around me turned into emptiness, and I became a part of it. No, rather, I became its inhabitant. The voice echoed in my head again. It wasn't made of sound. It was inside, as if someone was speaking directly to my soul. I realized that this wasn't just music. This wasn't just a strange sound. This was a gateway to another dimension, to a world where time didn't exist, where there were no other rules. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I felt my body losing its boundaries. It seemed to dissolve, disappearing into the dark clouds filling the space around me. But in this mess, there was one detail that I couldn't help but notice. It was a face. A face emerged from the fog, like a blurry reflection in water. It wasn't clear, but his eyes, I couldn't take my eyes off them. It was the same look I had seen in the mirror, the same eyes that had been part of my fear, but now they were mine. I felt them looking at me, consuming me whole. I was suffocating, not because the air was heavy, but because I didn't know where to go. I see nothing. I was left alone with his face. I felt his breath. I felt his presence next to me, as if he was standing a few millimeters away from me. Then I realized I was in the very place the voice had spoken of. It wasn't just a reflection, it was real. I was overcome with horror. I was not prepared for what was to happen next. I tried to turn around to run, but something held me back. I felt my legs losing strength and my body becoming part of these dark walls that weren't there, but were only sounds. Sounds that increasingly blocked out my thoughts. At some point, I felt my eyes start to burn. It wasn't pain. It was a feeling as if I was dissolving in this place, and it was consuming me with every moment. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't get out. I was too far gone. And then, when I could no longer keep my body from shaking in fear, everything disappeared. The darkness disintegrated, and I found myself in an empty room. The walls were light, but there was no life there. I stood alone, and only the sounds of distant noise reminded me that I was still alive. I soon realized all this was only the beginning. I will still return to this mirror. After all, if I had already ended up here, it could not have been an accident. I had to find an answer, to understand what was becoming more and more incomprehensible with each step. At some point, I realized that I couldn't stop. Every morning I woke up and the world around me seemed a little different. It was the same, but different. My eyes saw the same streets, the same houses, familiar faces. However, in my soul, in the depths of my consciousness, something had changed. There was no anxiety, no fear, just emptiness, as if I was trapped between reality and what could be. I could no longer remain in this constant bewilderment, in these doubts. That day, like many others, I began to search for answers again. I searched through books, old notes, ancient manuscripts, hoping to find some trace that might explain what was happening. But something in the words left me unsatisfied. The answers seemed like parts of a mosaic, but I didn't know how to piece them together. One day in the midst of this search, I remembered the mirror. Not just any mirror that you might find in any home, but one that I had found and that had become familiar to me since the first time I saw it. It was not like the others. This mirror didn't just reflect, it seemed to absorb, making me feel as if I was looking not into glass, but into another reality, into another dimension. I was drawn to it, as if it were something familiar and alien at the same time. I remembered the first time I had stood before it, and although at that moment I had wanted to push away from it, now I felt like the moment had come to return to where perhaps this whole story was leading. When I entered the basement where it was, I immediately felt a change. It was as dark as the heart of the night, and the silence was so thick that it seemed tangible. I walked as if on a path I was destined to follow. Each step echoed in the void, filling me with an increasingly strange feeling that I was no longer the master of my actions. Finally, I found myself in front of the mirror. It was old, its surface covered with dust and cracks, but it didn't matter. Something invisible was beckoning me there. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection, which showed not me, but something else. A shadow, a silhouette that was not me, but at the same time was a part of me. I stood before him, and despite the fear that gripped me, I felt that this was my only path. My body, as if it didn't obey me, stretched out its hand, and I touched the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. For a moment I felt something penetrate me, as if some stream of energy entered my fingers and spread throughout my body. Then the mirror stopped being just a reflection. It became something more. I felt it absorbing me, as if I were becoming part of this space, this world that lay beyond the ordinary. I found myself in a different place. Time and space lost all meaning. It was not just a dark space, it was something that defied description. It was empty and full at the same time. I could feel that there was something there, although I saw nothing but fog and darkness. But these sensations were so strong that it seemed that I myself became part of this emptiness. I tried to figure out where I was and what to do now. Every movement was heavy, as if the air was thickened to the point that it was hard to breathe. But I kept going, searching for something that could give me answers. Step by step, I moved deeper into this strange space, not knowing where I was going, but feeling that it was impossible to return. Suddenly, in the midst of this darkness, I felt some movement. Shadows or forms that I could not discern seemed to be watching me, but at the same time remained beyond my reach. This was not the world I knew. It was something different, alien and incomprehensible, but nevertheless mine. I felt a sense growing inside me that I had not just ended up here by chance. This place was connected to my destiny, to what I was looking for, although I could not yet understand what it was. I felt that the answers were here, in this space where there were no boundaries and no time, but at the same time I knew that the closer I got to the answer, the further it moved away from me. I couldn't go back and I couldn't stop. My body kept going in the direction that led me into the unknown. It wasn't just a journey, it was becoming, it was searching for myself. And I understood that the further I go, the more I lose myself, and the more I find what I can't understand. But something inside me told me that this is my path. Story 2. I live on an old farm in a small town that I don't even want to name. The city seemed lost in time. It was not in the news and was never mentioned in tourist guides. It was quiet, too quiet. The farm was a legacy left to me by my cousin when my parents died in an accident 2 years ago. I couldn't go back to their old home, and this farm, though it reminded me of them, was the last place I could find any solace. They always kept the farm in order, supported it, despite the fact that they worked in a local community program, helping in any way they could. Our family was big on taking care of animals, and one day when I was 16, they decided to get a greyhound. I don't remember her name, but I remember her always following me like a shadow, and she seemed to be a real part of my life. This dog became my friend, and even when I moved to the city, leaving everything behind, I remained connected to her. But she was gone so quickly. I remember that day. She just lay down, did not get up, and we buried her next to the kennel where she often rested. After her death, a lot changed. The farm seemed empty, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The empty space couldn't be filled, and even when I tried to fix the fence or renovate the front of the house, I couldn't get rid of the heaviness. It seemed like the place was destined to remain empty, and it depressed me. The air was cool that day when I returned from the grocery store, although the day was still quite bright. I always left home with the feeling that something was pulling me back. Everything I had bought was moving heavily in my bags from one hand to the other, and I felt fatigue settle on me, wrapping me from head to toe. Outside the farmhouse window, a green wheat field stank of old earth and abandoned tracks. I was too focused on not dropping the bags when I heard a strange sound. Something hit the floor hard. I looked back and noticed that one of the bags had tipped over and an apple had rolled across the floor. It rolled straight toward me, leaving marks on the floor that resembled the marks my dog made when he pulled or tried to catch something. I bent down to pick it up and noticed that there were bite marks on it. Small, neat marks, as if someone had used a dog's teeth. My hand froze in midair, and some sense of unease came over me. But perhaps it was just a coincidence. I couldn't allow myself to believe such nonsense. My nights became sleepless. I couldn't fall asleep without thinking about the past. But as I stood in my kitchen, trying to calm my nerves, I felt something change in the house. It wasn't just a feeling, it was almost a physical presence. It was there, like something invisible, lurking and waiting. I dismissed the thought, but the further I went, the clearer it became that I couldn't avoid it. When I finally decided to watch the news to take my mind off my nervousness, something caught my attention. I was standing at the window, flipping through the channels, when something just outside my field of vision caught my eye. I didn't immediately realize what it was, but after a few moments I saw a figure, large and slender. She was standing in the wheat just a few dozen meters from the fence. The tall greyhound, standing on its hind legs, was staring at me. It was strange. I could have sworn that it looked like the same dog that had left long ago. But how was that possible? It couldn't have been a real dog. All my memories of her were of her being long dead, and anything I could see now was just a figment of my imagination. The wind blew, and at that moment the greyhound jumped into the wheat, disappearing into it as if it had never been there. I froze. My heart was beating faster, and the strange feeling of anxiety I had already felt intensified. Immediately after that, I rushed to my truck, grabbing my shotgun with the intention of searching the field. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for, but I felt like I had to find the answer. But when I turned to look in the rearview mirror, my heart almost stopped. The greyhound was sitting right in my back seat. She was the same as before, with the same cold eyes, the same look I remembered. But something was wrong. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and fear pierced me to the bone. This wasn't just a dog. This was more. My breath hitched as I tried to keep myself sane. I suddenly realized that the dog was speaking to me in my father's voice. My heart sank. I remembered him as he was, always supportive, always there. But now his voice was strange. It wasn't just his voice. It was a shadow of what was left of him. "You've forgotten me, haven't you?" came from his voice, and the words seemed to pierce me like a knife. I tried to say something, but I couldn't. I was so scared. I didn't know what it meant. And when I finally turned around to look at the dog, it was gone, disappearing into the darkness. My hand was shaking as I tried to start the car, but I couldn't. It was like it was locked. I threw the keys down and ran out to the house, but at that very second, something hit me in the leg. It was an old bone, the same one I had played fetch with all those years ago. And in that moment, I realized that everything I had tried to forget had come back to me. Night fell quickly, and with it came the feeling of being trapped in my own home. I couldn't understand what was happening. The greyhound, my father's voice. This couldn't be real. Maybe I was crazy. But despite all my attempts to convince myself that it was just an illusion, all my senses told me that I was in some kind of trap, a trap from which there was no escape. I couldn't just forget everything that had happened. Fear and anxiety became my constant companions, and they wouldn't let me go. When I returned to the house, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. Everything seemed too quiet. It was a strange silence that was impossible to ignore. She was pressing down on me like the ceiling was about to collapse. There was not a single thought in my head except that I had to do something. I couldn't stay here. Again and again, I thought about what had happened on the field, what I had seen, or rather, what I thought I had seen. I stood by the window, trying to analyze my actions, trying to understand why I still couldn't come to my senses. My eyes involuntarily searched for that same greyhound again, but nothing was visible. The wheat field seemed as lifeless and empty as before. Everything was in its place, but everything was not as before. I sighed and walked through the house trying to regain some peace. But it was no use. Every corner, every old floorboard, every creak, everything reminded me of the past. It seemed to me that I could not move forward, that I was stuck in this place within these walls which became more and more threatening with each passing day. As I walked up to my bedroom, I suddenly remembered an old photograph I had found a few days ago. It was one of us, me, my parents, and the dog, posing against the backdrop of the farm, in the very clearing where my house now stood. Smiling faces all together, no worries, no problems. I took the photo and looked at it for a long time. We were all happy, but now, after so many years, everything was different. I tried to remember how I felt then, at that time when everything seemed so simple and clear. But the more I tried to focus, the more I felt my memory begin to disintegrate. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt happy. Was it before the accident, or before that, when we were all safe and sound? I didn't know, and that scared me. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine. I shuddered and looked around. There was no one. Everything was quiet. But the feeling that someone was there did not leave me, as if I was not alone. I put the photo back on the table and walked out of the bedroom, trying to get rid of this feeling. My body moved automatically, but my mind was overcome with anxiety. I headed toward the kitchen to get myself some water, but something stopped me. There was a piece of paper on the table. I didn't remember leaving it there, and the sight of it made me freeze for a moment. It was covered in strange scribbles, as if someone was writing and couldn't stop. I went closer and tried to read. Nothing came out. Symbols, letters, words that didn't make sense. They were just there, written in a strange, twisted handwriting. I felt the blood drain from my face and jumped back. It's not me, I told myself, trying to calm down. But the fear didn't go away. It held me tightly like invisible hands and wouldn't let go. I quickly walked to the door, hoping to at least get some fresh air. I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what else could happen. When I went outside, I immediately noticed a strange movement in the field. A slight movement in the air, as if someone was walking there, although there was no living creature to be seen. Only a shadow that moved through the wheat, like an invisible person hiding from view. I stopped, froze, unable to move. My heart sank with fear. This was something more terrible than I could have imagined. It wasn't just my imagination. I knew something was happening, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and froze. There was no one. However, the air was heavy, filled with something elusive. I was alone. I should have been alone, but this feeling wouldn't leave me. Something was there, and it was watching me. It was like there was someone hiding behind my back, and I couldn't escape it. I went back into the house, but now I felt uneasy. Everything around me felt heavy and strange. I didn't know what to do, but now I knew for sure. Something was wrong. I tried not to think about how I could become part of this game. I didn't know where it would all lead, but I also knew I couldn't run from it. It was chasing me, and I was too close to escape. The night was dark and starless, like those moments when everything loses its meaning and the space between two worlds narrows, turning it into a narrow passage that is difficult to pass through. I stood in my house not knowing what to do. Fear did not leave me, and the feeling that something invisible was watching my every step became almost tangible. I could no longer ignore what was happening on the field, in the place where I once played with the greyhound. I constantly felt this cold gaze on me, as if I was in a gun sight. Whether I got out of bed at night to check what was there, or just sat there trying to regain my composure, this feeling did not leave me. Greyhound. She was connected to this house, to this land, to those shadows that remained in the night, haunting me. For a long time, I couldn't understand why all this was happening. Was I really that weak? Could it be that the loss of my parents and everything I knew and loved left such a deep crack in my soul? Or did I become a victim of some nightmare in which I was not only a participant, but also the main character? Shadow on the field. In the evenings when the sun was setting, I would go out to the threshold and look into the darkness. The wheat, swaying in the wind, became not just earth, but something alive, something that never forgets and never forgives. And I saw something moving there, in that field, like something invisible but tangible, hiding in the night shadows, constantly moving. I increasingly felt how the past seeped into the present, reminding me of itself. Not only memories of my parents and childhood, but also those moments that seemed forgotten, the dark corners of my life that I tried so hard to sweep under the carpet. Greyhound. I couldn't forget her, but something about this creature was different now. I no longer felt the warmth and affection she had brought when she was alive. She was something more now, something dark and uncomprehending. I decided to return to the field despite the worries that tormented me. I was sure that if I could figure out what was happening, I would be able to get rid of this feeling of obsessive fear. I took the flashlight and stepped into the night. It was only when I was on the field that I felt the air around me getting colder and my steps starting to sound loud in the deathly silence. The wheat, which had been silky and soft until now seemed hard and prickly, as if piercing my legs with every step. I walked slowly, listening to every sound. And then there it was again, that shadow in front of me. I felt it coming out of nowhere, from the dark depths of the wheat, from somewhere I had been avoiding. A greyhound. Or what was now her. She stood on her hind legs just as she had when I first saw her in the dark wheat field. Her gaze was cold, hard, and merciless. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and the more I looked, the more unbearable the feeling became that something was wrong. She wasn't alive. She was something else, something I couldn't understand and couldn't explain. She had become part of this place, part of this land, part of what was lost. I took a step forward but suddenly stopped, as if someone invisible had grabbed my shoulder. The wind died down and everything around me froze. I didn't know what to do. Run away, deviate from the path, or keep going, despite the voice inside me screaming that this was a mistake. She didn't move. She didn't take a single step. She just stood there, on the edge of light and shadow, watching me. I was trapped. If I took a step toward her, she would stay. If I turned my back, I would run. But that wouldn't be an escape. My legs wouldn't move, as if I was chained to that spot. Suddenly, I felt the tension around me change. It wasn't just a sense of threat. It was something far more terrifying than I could have imagined. It was a sense that she was waiting for something from me, an expectation that demanded an answer. I suddenly realized that she was a part of my life, a part of the very story I was trying to forget. I took a step forward, and in that moment, like that first glimpse of her on the field, the air around me changed again. It wasn't just a presence. It was a living force that wouldn't let me move on. It was more than just a memory. It wasn't just a dog. It was a loss I couldn't get over, but now I was ready to accept it. I took a step back, but I didn't feel relief. This wasn't the end. This was just a new stage. The question remained, why was she here? And what did I need to do to end this nightmare? Every night, as soon as it got dark, I felt my heart begin to beat faster. The questions I had tried to avoid came back to me again and again. Why couldn't I forget about the greyhound? Why was all this happening to me? My life, which had once been so ordinary, was now filled with fear and uncertainty. I no longer knew what was real and what was a figment of my sick imagination. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of anxiety that wouldn't let go of me, even in the simplest of actions. When I looked out the window, the field in front of the house looked as if nothing had changed. However, something in the air was different than usual. The wheat was swaying in the wind. But even in this, it seemed to me that there was someone in the field. I was at a loss as to what to do with what was happening. I wanted to run, to hide, to leave this farm and everything associated with it behind. But deep down, I knew that was not the solution. I couldn't just walk away. This land was a part of me, and what I felt on the field, what happened at night, it was my struggle with what I was trying to forget. I decided to spend the day on the farm. Maybe if I continued to live my normal life, I could deal with this nightmare, get rid of it. I mended the old fence, checked the cows, cleaned the barn, all the same daily chores that once brought me peace. But it was all automatic. My hands were moving, but my mind was somewhere far away, trying to figure out what kind of entity I had attracted to my farm. In the evening, when the sun had almost set, I felt that gaze again. It was familiar, cold, implacable. I looked around, expecting to see her, but there was nothing. Silence. Only the rustle of the wind and the whisper of the wheat. And then, when I was about to turn around and go back into the house, I heard footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, but so familiar. I turned around sharply, and there, among the dark silhouettes of the ears of corn, she appeared. The greyhound. I froze in place. My heart was pounding, and I felt my chest tighten with fear. She was standing in the same place where I had seen her before, but now she was closer. I didn't know how long she had been watching me, but it was obvious that she was waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. Her gaze was fixed, almost hypnotic. I stood there unable to look away, as if I was tied to this place by invisible threads. And then I realized, this is not just a nightmare. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something real, something I had conjured up, something that would never leave me. I took a step forward without realizing why. Step by step, my body moved as if by the will of something else. There were no thoughts or doubts in my head. I walked towards her as if something was forcing me to cross this threshold, this terrible barrier. As I approached, the greyhound did not retreat. She stood motionless, like a statue, her eyes unblinking, expressionless. I felt everything around me disappear. There was only her and me. Suddenly, without warning, she took a step towards me. I recoiled but could not move. Fear gripped me, and even though I wanted to turn and run, my legs wouldn't budge. She came up to me, and I felt the cold seep into my bones as her gaze met mine again. I felt her begin to move, her feet barely touching the ground. She was like a shadow, like a ghost, gliding through the shadows of the night, leaving no trace. But her presence was unimaginably real. Then, as if something invisible had pulled a string in my memory, I remembered the moment it all began. I remember being 16 and my parents bringing her home. That greyhound. She was my friend, the one I always needed. We grew up together. I played with her on the field like a normal kid with his pet. But now at this moment, it was not just a memory. I began to understand that this greyhound was not just a pet. It was connected to something much deeper and darker. Now standing in front of her, I felt the memories of that time begin to come back. Of death, of what I could not do, of how it all ended too soon. The greyhound stood before me as something more than just an animal. It was a creature that was part of what I had lost, something I could not get back. There was no mercy in her eyes. A shadow from the past appeared to me again, bringing with it not only sadness, but also painful memories that I could not shake off. I stood in front of her, waiting to see what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't get away from this. I couldn't forget what had already happened. Several days had passed since I had seen the greyhound again. The night was filled with anxiety, and every morning I woke up as if someone was watching me. This feeling never left me. I checked every part of the farm, even the little nooks and crannies where there had been no people or animals before. But despite all my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling. On the field, I felt her presence, as if she were not just a physical being, but a part of the earth itself. The very wind that I once loved so much now seemed alien, unnatural. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something huge and dark was waking up on this earth, pulling me back to the past I was trying to leave behind. I decided to talk to the locals, although I knew it might not give me any answers. But I was ready for anything. I didn't know what else to do. That day I met an old man who used to work with my parents. He was one of those people who knew them before they started doing social work. His face was haggard and his eyes were full of worry, as if he knew too much but didn't want to share it. I turned to him, trying to understand what was going on, but the old man just remained silent and looked at the ground. Finally, he said one simple word that made my hair stand on end. Greyhound. He didn't explain anything further. He just said the word and walked away, as if it had been written into his life. I stood there, unsure what to do with this knowledge that perhaps I shouldn't have known. At home, I tried to relax, but my thoughts wouldn't leave me. I felt that cold again. I didn't know what it was that kept me going, what pushed me to look for answers, but I couldn't stop. My life became impossible without finding the answer to what was happening on the farm. That night, I saw her again. This time, she wasn't sitting on the scarecrow like before. No, she was standing right at the gate, as if she was waiting for me. And in her gaze, I felt again that same coldness, that same fear. It was like a reminder, like a warning against something I couldn't understand. I gathered my strength and headed towards her again. But this time, something was different. With every step, with every breath, I felt the force that had always drawn me to her grow stronger. I didn't go just out of curiosity. I felt like I had to. I was connected to her in a way I couldn't explain. As soon as I got close enough to her, she took a step forward, and I felt the air around me become thicker, colder. My breathing quickened and my heart pounded so hard I felt like it would burst out of my chest, but I couldn't stop. I kept moving, and at some point I was very close to her. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger. There was only silent condemnation, as if she was waiting for something I couldn't understand. But in that moment, I understood one thing. I was part of that shadow. Everything that happened, everything I saw, was connected to me. It was my mistake. I was connected to this creature not just as a pet. I was connected to her by what I had done, by what I had left behind. I felt anxiety creeping up on me again. And at that moment, I realized that all those night visions, all those steps in the dark, were not just a coincidence. It was a warning. I couldn't run away from it. Everything that was happening was just part of my own inner world. I had to do something to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. The mystery I was trying to solve was becoming more and more engrossing to me, and I realized that I couldn't get away from it until I figured it out completely. But the further I went in search of the truth, the more I realized that I didn't really need to look for the answer. It was already inside me. With every step I took, I felt more and more like this farm was becoming a part of me, like its shadows were swallowing me whole. I could no longer tell where reality ended and my fear began. But despite this, I knew one thing. I could not leave until I faced what was lurking in these shadows.